In September 2013, an activist and hacker group called the Syrian Electronic Army hijacked the websites of the New York Times, sharethis.com, the huffingtonpost.co.uk, and twitter.co.uk. This resulted in traffic to those websites being temporarily redirected to a server under the attacker's control. If large, established, and high-tech companies like these aren't safe from hackers, are our small business, e-commerce, and publishing websites safe? Is our email safe? If you want to learn what you can do to prevent this from happening to you, stay tuned. I have 3 short sponsor messages before we get into today's show. First, if you have a great domain name and nothing to show when people visit, you're missing out on potential advertising revenue, leads, and partnership opportunities. Nichewebsites.com can build you a site quickly with a price option to suit any need. But as their tagline says, they don't just build websites, they build businesses. Second, if you're buying or selling a domain name or a portfolio and you want an estimate of its value, Estimate.com is the place to go. Just like you'd visit Zillow.com to get an estimate of a house value, Estimate.com provides key information about the most important statistics so you can make an informed decision based on data. Finally, DNX.com is a domain name exchange that uses a reverse auction platform to provide fair market prices for quality domain names that are manually filtered by an experienced broker. At DNX.com, domain prices drop until someone decides the price is right. But don't wait too long or the domain you love might be purchased by someone else. All 3 sponsors have a clickable banner in the upper right-hand corner of DomainSherpa.com. Here's your program. Hey everyone, my name is Michael Seiger and I'm the publisher of DomainSherpa.com, the website where you come to learn how to become a successful domain name investor and entrepreneur directly from the experts. As I mentioned in the introduction, one of the websites that was recently attacked by the Syrian Electronic Army was the New York Times. Turns out nytimes.com was compromised by what's called a spear phishing attack at one of the resellers of the registrar named Melbourne IT. So I reached out to Melbourne IT to ask them to come on the show, talk about the situation, and help us all understand how we can protect our domain names, websites, and email from hackers in the future. I'm pleased to welcome to the show Dr. Bruce Tonkin, Chief Technology Officer at Melbourne IT. Bruce, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Michael.
Some of our readers haven't ever heard of Melbourne IT. Before we get into the details of what happened, how it happened, and preventive measures, let's start with a little background. Can you tell me about Melbourne IT?
Yes, well, Melbourne IT started off at the University of Melbourne in Australia back in 1996. And we were the first administrator for .com.au domain names. And then towards the late sort of 1999, 2000, we became one of the first 5 registrars for registering .com domain names. So we're now roughly the 6th largest registrar in the world with respect to registering .com and other domain names. We have a high proportion of domain names with large companies. So often if a large company is attacked, they'll come to us for assistance. And since then, we've also branched out into hosting domain name websites and hosting email for customers, as well as search engine marketing and other services you'd expect from a web services company.
Great. And I mentioned earlier that you're the Chief Technology Officer at Melbourne IT. What does your role involve?
Basically involves looking after the strategic technology direction of the company. I've been very heavily involved in the development of the domain name industry. I'm in fact on the board of ICANN and have been on vice chairman of the board for several years, and also deal with sort of major suppliers and major customers, I guess.
Excellent. And I appreciate you coming on the show and helping us understand from a technical standpoint what actually happened. So before we dig into the technical details so that people can understand it, let's define what the problem is, because I read a lot of stories in the general media, domain name hacking, domain name theft, phishing. Let's start with how do you define what domain name hijacking is?
I think hijacking is generally considered to be a malicious act by another party to gain control of your domain name. And once they gain control of your domain name, they can redirect your website to another place, and they can even redirect and capture email, although there hasn't been a lot of evidence of that being done yet.
Okay, and how is hijacking, when somebody takes control of your domain name, different from domain name theft?
I would say that hijacking and theft are basically the same thing.
Okay.
Although the other scenario I think that happens is there are other ways in which people can lose control of their domain name. So suddenly you see your website's gone off the air, and you might think someone's stolen my domain name. In actual case, it may simply be that the domain name has not been renewed, and the name has been suspended in some form. And then you do have a period of time, typically from 30, sometimes 45 days to respond once your domain name has been suspended. But after that point, it can actually be given to a new user quite legitimately.
Yeah, and I think that case actually happens to more people than theft and theft / hijacking, where a domain name actually just expires. I remember that happened to me back in 2005 or 6. I had a website that was a publishing company that was generating a lot of traffic, a lot of revenue, and suddenly somebody sent me an email or called me and said, hey, your website isn't working. And I typed in the address and went there, and it went to a parking page. And back in those days, I didn't know what parking page was. So just a listing of ads. And I'm like, somebody stole my website, or somebody, your brain goes in all different directions. And so what had actually happened is I was negligent and missed one of the renewal emails, and my domain name expired. And so, that I think I just want to clarify, because you bring up a great point that negligence in letting your domain name expire is different from a malicious act of a third party to take control of your domain name.
That's right. And the best way to protect yourself on the renewal front, most registrars now allow you to set the domain name up to be an auto-renew. And typical domain names, you can register them from 1 to 10 years, but a lot of people just register them for 1 year because it's less cash up front.
Right, exactly.
But if you're going to do that, then you should set it to an auto-renew and leave your credit card on file, because then it will just automatically renew. You can always cancel it, so it's not like you're locked in, but it's good to have the safety net of knowing that it'll automatically be renewed if you're on holidays, etc.
Right. So how frequently does domain name theft happen, Bruce? Are there any statistics about that? It seems like there's a rash in the media outlets nowadays talking about domain name theft, but how frequent is it?
It's not very frequent. I mean, we have sort of, I guess, 3 million names under management, 3 to 4 million names under management. We might see, the equivalent of an incident, probably once every few months, where somebody, for various reasons, has lost control of the name, and in nearly all cases we can help them get it back. And the industry generally is very cooperative. So. When names have gone to another registrar, we will maintain pretty good personal contact with each other, and we can usually get the name back for the customer, or get the control back for the customer.
Great. Can you talk about the specific incident that happened with New York nytimes.com?
Yeah, that was a case where there was obviously they were targeting media companies deliberately to take control of their names. And I think what has happened in the past, if you go back a few years, the typical method was a denial of service attack. So you try and generate a lot of traffic and then blast the websites. Media companies can actually defend themselves reasonably well against that, because it's mostly static content. It's not people logging in and making changes. And when it's mostly static content, you can duplicate that in many places around the internet. And so it's fairly easy to defend that against a denial of service attack. So what the attackers have instead done is said, okay, if we can get control of their domain name, we can then point their whole website to another location. And again, the hackers will try and find different ways into a registrar system. And most registrars, again, have hardened their systems pretty strongly. So it's pretty hard to directly hack a registrar or somehow find a flaw in the software that they're running. But the weakest link is often a human link. And so what they have done is they've found um, by, I guess, searching on the internet and looking at various sources, they've identified the names of employees of companies that are looking after a media website. And then they've constructed a what's called a spear phishing email, which is the reason why it's called spear phishing. It's very targeted. It's not like a scam where you're trying to confuse somebody into um, handing over millions of dollars or whatever, some of the scams, but they're broad brush. They're sent to millions of people. A spear phishing email is saying, we know that there's probably, we don't know exactly, but it's one of these 10 or 20 people that are probably involved in managing this domain name. We will send an email to them that looks like it's from someone they know. Could be from a colleague, could be from their boss. It's an email that looks like the sort of email that you should open. And the email is constructed in a way that it looks like it's from someone that you know and trust, and the subject looks like something you should investigate. And then inside the email is a link, and you're encouraged to click on that link. And then you get some sort of message that comes up and says, "Oh, look, whoops, your access to the system seems to have dropped. You better re-enter your username and password." And because you think you're in a trusted environment, you've opened an email from someone you trust, you've been sent somewhere, and it says to proceed to the next step, you need to re-enter your username and password, and it's done in a way that you think you're perfectly safe, and you do that. Then the hackers have actually got a username and password, which they can then use to access the domain name account where the targeted domain name was located.
Right. And is that what happened with the New York Times? Did the Syrian Electronic Army send a bunch of targeted emails to people that they thought might be in control of the domain name registrar account? And one of those people signed into a reseller for Melbourne IT?
Yes, that's correct.
And once they had access, that's just like me signing into, into my registrar account at GoDaddy. I can change any of the information that's in there without any oversight.
That's correct. Yes.
All right. And did they end up changing? A lot of times I'll get an email from a registrar saying some information on your account was changed. Do you know if all registrars do something like that, where they confirm via email any changes to an account?
Yeah, that's certainly available. In these situations, often it was a reseller account, and it's a slightly different account to a normal consumer account, because it's assumed that the reseller, if that was happening, they'd be getting lots of emails all day, and so generally that kind of feature's not turned on.
I gotcha.
And then that reseller in turn is managing the customer, and it depends on, again, what the customer wants from that reseller. Yeah.
Right. And so when they signed into a reseller account, so they didn't go to melbourneIT.com.au, they went to some third-party account that actually connects into your system. They sell domain names and hosting on behalf of Melbourne IT. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
okay.
They would see, in this particular case, they would know that they've come to Melbourne IT, but they'd also know that they're accessing a reseller account within Melbourne IT.
Gotcha.
So basically have the name of the reseller.
Yep.
But it would also be clear that it's Melbourne IT.
Okay, I understand. And then they basically change information in the reseller account, and then that computer connects to your computer and updates in your computer, and then it propagates around the web. So what they did was they changed where that domain name, nytimes.com, points to. And instead of pointing to the New York Times web server or system of servers, they pointed it to some other place where they actually were trying to install spyware on the computers that visited.
Yeah, as far as we know, there was no attempt to install spyware or anything on computers. Okay. I think it was purely a lot of these more politically motivated attacks typically aren't malicious in the sense that they're trying to harm users. What they're really trying to do typically is either most commonly embarrass the target company and then get some sort of political message out. So rarely in those cases do we see malware or spyware, and in this case we have no evidence of that.
And they want to target large companies or with broad bases like the New York Times. If they targeted, Domain Sherpa, for example, they'd only reach a very small portion of people, and they want to get their message out as broadly as possible. So that's
That's
why
right.
companies like the New York Times or large multinational companies that would be featured in the news for a hacking incident are more targeted than small companies like mine.
That's right, yeah, and increasingly they're targeting government websites as well.
Mm-hmm.
Same concept, if you can, if you're unhappy with a particular government stance, you try and access one of their high-profile websites and say, look, this government is wrong and this is why.
Yeah. So once the New York Times noticed that their website wasn't pointing at their web server and it was pointing to a different location, how long does it usually take in order to fix something like that so it correctly points to the proper location?
Yeah, actually, the actual fix is almost instantaneous. And one of the things that was interesting in this case is I would see hours, even a day later, people still saying that they couldn't reach the relevant website. And the reason for that is that the internet protocols are designed to be fairly resilient in that your computer typically remembers where it has recently been. And so it doesn't have to keep asking for the translation between the domain name and the target location where the content is. So typically you'll keep the information for about 48 hours. And so what happens in these cases is if, let's say, a domain name changed in the next 5 minutes, so 5 minutes time, the domain name's going to change. Now, if I've visited the website right this instant, I'm actually going to have the right answer, if you like, for the next 48 hours. So I won't even notice the attack, won't even hit me because I've already stored the correct information. But then I have some downtime for 5 minutes. So I put some bad information in there for 5 minutes. If a user happens to visit your website during that 5-minute period, they will store a copy of that wrong information and then keep it for 48 hours. Someone that then logs in 10 minutes later after I fixed it will actually pull the correct information. So it's one of these funny things because, there was Twitter feeds and various things going out saying, hey, look, this website's been hacked. A lot of people in the community go, I better go and have a look, and mostly journalists. And so in doing that, all the journalists within this period of time stored the bad information. And then when they kept going back, they kept saying, still down, it's still down. It wasn't actually. And for most users, it wouldn't be because the average user didn't look at it 10 minutes ago and is looking at the new information and they've got the right information. Someone that looked at it yesterday has still got the right information from yesterday and won't be impacted either. So you get this strange impact where people are screaming it's down, but probably only for 10% of the users. Just 10% of those users were in the media industry.
Yeah. And when you say your computer is storing the wrong information, it's not actually caching and storing the content that's on the web page. It's actually storing the location, the IP address of where that domain name should point to, which web server it should go to.
I'm simplifying it a little bit. It's typically an internet service provider will actually store some of that information in their network, and therefore the impact can impact the members.
So there's multiple places. It can be my computer. It can be my ISP like Comcast that stores that DNS domain name server information for the domain name. So there could be multiple ways that this issue is being confounded.
That's right. So once the sort of, if you like, the root cause, which was the change of the domain name, that was fixed very quickly.
Right.
But then I think the issue was then contacting ISPs and others and saying, flush, reset your computers so that they get rid of that bad information.
So they need to flush out the DNS records that they're storing. Is that what it is?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay. So, and do I have to do that on my local computer? Like if I run a company and I pointed it at the wrong location, or let's say I just upgraded my web service and it was pointed at one website and then I moved it to a different server at a different hosting company and I pointed it to the information that that new host gave me, but I'm still seeing the old website on my computer. Is there a way that I can flush that out of my computer or my ISP?
You certainly can do it at the computer level, but it's beyond what normal users would be able to do. I mean, mostly when you're doing a deliberate change, you just have to assume it's going to take 48 hours to take effect. I mean, common number you hear in the industry. So
48 hours.
you plan it, and you normally, if you're going to do a DNS change, you do it on a weekend or
Yep.
something, so that your customers are not affected, or in the middle of the night or whatever.
Yeah.
But typically, a change takes what we say is 48 hours to propagate, which means within a 48-hour period, all the computers around the network have reset themselves. Some straight away, but
Mm-hmm.
99% within 48 hours.
All right. Great rule of thumb to keep in mind for anybody that's updating their website and pointing their DNS at a different server. So let's talk about how people can, businesses can prevent their domain names from being stolen or hijacked. What are some different ways that they should make sure that they're aware of, Bruce?
Yeah, look, I think there's probably three things. The first thing is, take advantage of auto renew to at least make sure your name doesn't accidentally expire.
Right.
The second one is what's referred to as a registrar lock, which is essentially a lock on your domain name within your service provider. And what that lock does is it stops the name being transferred to another registrar. And that was a method of hijack that was common about 10 years ago, where you would front up, or a malicious party would front up to another registrar, and they'd say, "We're moving our business to you. Here's our domain name." And that would set up a whole series of automated steps. But it was actually possible to transfer the domain name to another registrar and then change the records.
Mm-hmm.
So now mostly registrars automatically put a name on lock when you register the name. And then if you want to actually transfer it to another party, you log into the registrar and essentially turn the lock off. And you also get a special password called an auth code that you have to give to the new registrar. So a couple of factors of authentication there, essentially, that you have to turn a lock off, you have to get a special transfer passcode, and that's reduced the incidence of being able to hijack by moving it to another party first.
Right. But
essentially the protection is make sure your name is locked at the registrar. And then the third method of protection is commonly used by larger companies, which is referred to a registry lock. And that's a lock at the core database that stores the DNS information for the domain names. And what that actually does is it turns off all automated processes. And so to make any change on the name requires manual, essentially staff-to-staff contact. So a staff person at a registrar is actually directly, manually contacting a staff person at the registry and exchanging, security codes to make that change happen. So that means it's going to be slow. So if you were an end user, you'd have to contact your registrar, probably ring them up. They'd have to work out who you were, so they'd have a process for identifying who you were. Once they've identified who you were, then they in turn contact the registry, and the registry has a whole series of checks to verify that they're talking to the right person at the registrar, and then the change gets made. So really you'd have to plan it a day ahead. You couldn't just change when you wanted to. And if you got it wrong, you'd have to go through the whole thing again, because it's not going to get switched back again either. Same protocol. So you got to make sure you plan it carefully, you make the change and you get it right, because there's no going back. It'll take you another 24 hours to go through that process.
Yeah, that seems pretty laborious to go through that process. Do a lot of companies take advantage of a registry lock like that?
I think there's two aspects of it. I think one is there's a lack of market knowledge that this lock exists. Mm-hmm. And typically it's a case of closing the door after the horse has bolted. And often you'll see companies that have got their name on registry lock have probably experienced some issue. And in response to that issue, the registrar said, you can put it on registry lock. And they go, great, we'll put it on registry lock. But often at the time when their names are coming up for registration or renewal, and the registrar mentions it and says, look, I've got this extra feature, it'll add sort of 24 hours of time. It costs more because we're doing manual processes. A lot of them just say, oh, no, we won't worry about that. We'll be fine.
Right. Because they don't even understand why it's a benefit to them.
That's correct.
Yeah.
So I think, we certainly recommend companies, because a lot of large companies, they're running big IT departments. They don't make changes very often.
Right.
And when they do, they've got a whole IT team that does testing and checking and so on. So, we recommend it for large companies, but mostly for what we call their primary domain name. If it was a company like, say, IBM, then obviously IBM.com is their primary name. You'd want to protect that. they might have other names. They might have mainframe.com or storage.com or something. And if something goes wrong, it's not the end of the world. But for their main core domain name, you probably want every protection you can get.
Right, and that was actually the case with the latest Syrian hacker episode. One of the domain names of Twitter was on registry lock, not the .co.uk, but the .com, I believe, was on registry lock. So the attackers couldn't change the domain name server records, where the domain name actually points.
Yes.
But they did change the who is information, what actually displays as the registrant of the domain name.
Correct. Yes.
When people look it up.
That's correct. Yeah. So pretty much, as far as the end user was concerned, they saw no impact with Twitter because their name was on lock. The other thing to understand, though, is that registry lock feature is not available for all domain name types.
Oh,
so
okay.
It is available for .com and .net. It is available for .com.au in Australia, but it is not yet available for .co.uk.
Okay.
As an example. So, yeah.
Okay, I understand. So back to the second way to protect your domain names, it's the registrar lock. I think by default, aren't most domain names that are registered today locked by the registrar by default?
Yeah, that's right. Most registrars do that by default, and you explicitly turn it off. But it varies. But certainly you'd want to make sure that at the very least your name is on lock, and you can usually log into your registrar account and verify that.
Yeah.
Because like other sorts of locks, sometimes the registrar will make you take the lock off to make certain changes, and so somebody could have taken the lock off for some reason but forgot to put it back on and things like that.
Right. Now, it seems like the big security hole to the registrar lock is that if you get access to the email account on record for that registrar account, you pretty much have full access to do whatever you want to the domain names in that account.
That's right. If you manage to get access to somebody's email address, then you can then go to not just registrars but any really online service, because most online services, whenever you click forgot my password, it basically sends a new credentials to that email address. So definitely protecting the credentials for your email is very important. And I think the other thing that is probably increasingly recommended these days is to have more than username and password control on your email account, and have some other factor. Maybe a text message gets sent to your mobile phone and you have to enter in a code, or sorts of things that are becoming more prevalent in the online banking industry. That if you've got $1 million in your account, you probably don't want to just have a username password to access it.
Right, exactly. Two-factor authentication. And, with the new iPhones coming out talking about putting a thumbprint on that might be another factor authentication, so that if you want to transfer in the future, so if you want to transfer out, do something really significant to a domain name, change where it points, transfer it to another registrar, maybe you have to use that factor to authenticate.
I think that's right. I mean, we're sort of investigating some additional factors that we will provide, and it's varied over time. One of the challenges being, I quite like the thumbprint idea. That kind of depends on having it widely available in devices. So if the iPhone has that feature, that would be great. Going back a few years ago, you would typically get some sort of electronic token, and that's great if you're doing something every day. But like with a domain name account, you probably only touch it once a year. People would then lose the token, so you're forever sending tokens out. And then people go, I want to make a change. You go, well, where's your token? They go, I've lost it. And so, well, I'll mail it to you, but that'll take a day or so. And so, that's the trade-offs. Whereas the fact that most people have a mobile device means that some use of the mobile phone in authentication is helpful. But even then, people leave their phones in taxis, and a lot of the times the phones aren't properly protected.
Right.
And probably that's one of the weakest security links today, is that there's lots of software that you can put on your PC. You've got passwords and encryption and all sorts of things. Whereas a lot of people with their phones, they'll store their passwords on their phones, and then they'll lose their phone in the taxi. And so, I've got their password on the phone and I've got their phone. You can do a lot of damage with that.
Definitely. Well, just having access to their email right then. They can
Yeah.
sign on to Amazon. It'll probably remember them. They can make a purchase. They can sign into the registrar and request an email password change. It comes directly to the phone. They can check it. So yeah, there's a lot of different ways that hackers can gain access to your email account, which then controls so many things. So
So many things, yeah.
do you recommend that people not use free email accounts or only use a specific email address for domain name administration or anything like that, Bruce?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges actually is that uh, we we have a system of basically publishing the details of the person that is registering the domain name, and
Right.
this system's called Whois. And the problem with that is it actually opens you up for social engineering attacks because you know the person's name and address, which you can use in other forums. So you can actually ring someone up, and they might say, "Okay, I just want to verify who you are. What's your address?" Well, you have it because it's published on the Whois. Or you can actually target their email account because that email account's been published. And so I think, yeah, if you want to be really particular about your security, perhaps use a different email address that's published in your Whois from your email address that you might use for private communications.
Hmm. What about who is privacy? There's a way to obfuscate all of the information that somebody can use to look up. So if I go to whois.domaintools.com and I look up domainsherpa.com, it'll tell me, the registrant information, which is actually my information. But do you recommend that I pay extra money to my registrar to hide all that information and then have information sent through a third-party service to me?
Yeah, we certainly offer that service to users. We're fine. I think about 30% of people typically take up that service at the time of registration, but that's probably increasing. I mean, I think we're probably seeing that getting closer to 50% at the time of domain name renewals, presumably because they think, well, my name's actually getting more important now, and
Mm-hmm.
I don't really want to have this information published. So,
Right.
yeah, increasingly people are selecting that option. Especially when people, I would certainly recommend it if you're using your home address for a domain name. So a lot of small businesses operate from home. Often it's a second job. They've got a day job and then they're operating a startup business from home, and they use their home address to register the domain name. So in that case, I would certainly recommend taking advantage of the privacy service. Another thing is when you're dealing with more corporate uses, it might it might be best to use a role name rather than your actual name. So you might say contact name as Chief Technology Officer at Melbourne IT rather than
Mm-hmm.
Bruce Tonkin, for example.
And are you allowed to
Just
do that by registry rules to not use a real person's name as the registrant, but to use domain administrator or chief technology officer or something like that?
well, the actual name of the domain name in that instance, the organisation name is the legal name of the company that's applying. So the actual registrant name, if it was our company, the registrant name would be Melbourne IT. So that's the actual owner of the name. And then the role-based contacts are often better because people change in roles, and so often companies will use roles like domain administrator or IT manager or things like that. And often that's more useful because you can ring up a company and say, "Can I speak to the IT manager?" And if the person changes, that's fine. And bear in mind that a lot of corporate names are registered for 10 years, so it's a reasonable chance that the person that registered the name isn't there in 10 years' time.
Right. Are there services that will monitor your domain name for any changes and email you if anything does change?
Yeah, there is. Yeah, it's quite a few services that you can employ to monitor changes in DNS records. It's subject to the sorts of issues I mentioned earlier. That okay, you get a notification that your record's changed. Yes, you can change it back. That's easy. The trouble is the fact that people have stored the bad information for a period,
Right.
so the impact lasts for longer than the few minutes it takes you to fix it.
Right, but if I somehow lose access to my registrar account, I can use a third party tool to monitor my domain name and
Yes,
tell me if it's actually pointing at a different location.
absolutely. Yes.
And does Melbourne IT as a registrar offer a service like that?
Yeah, we used to. We actually sold. We had a more corporate focused division, which we've sold in March of this year. But something, yeah, we'll have another look at, because a lot of the services that we're offering purely to corporates, we only provided through that division, including the registry lock actually. And then with this most recent incident, we realised that a lot of smaller businesses have been contacting us. So we are starting to launch a lot more, or make available a lot of the services that we provided to big companies to small companies as well. So
Great.
yeah, certainly look at that.
And I'll just throw out that I do know of at least one service that does that, domaintools.com, where you can sign up for an account and they'll monitor a certain number of domains for you and notify you if there's any changes. So if you want a third party just watching, that's an opportunity as well. So we talked about a lot of different ways for people to protect their assets, their domain names, so that people don't get access to steal the domain name from them. The worst case of stealing, of course, is then they change, they get access to the registrar account, they unlock it at the registrar, they request the EPP code, the authorization code that allows them to transfer it to another domain name registrar. What can happen if a thief does do that, Bruce?
That's always very problematic, because it's gone away from your current supplier, and the new supplier could be in China, could be in a completely different country, and so then you've got, you don't have the access to the local laws, presumably. So you definitely want to avoid that. Having said that, though, the first point of contact would be to go back to your original registrar, because that registrar's probably got the best chance of contacting through their own private channels the other registrar. And there's a fair bit of cooperation in the industry when those things happen, which is fairly unusual. But when it does, we all tend to cooperate with each other to get the name back to the rightful owner.
So if I have a domain name stolen, somehow that they get the domain name out of my account and to another account, and I can determine that by doing a whois lookup of the domain
yes.
name at any of the registrars, including Melbourne IT or whois.domaintools.com, and look it up, and I see that it's at another registrar. What you're saying is that it's to my advantage to contact my old registrar, my
Yes.
current service provider, because they're more apt to be able to get information quicker by directly dealing with the new registrar to resolve the issue.
That's right, because otherwise you call up the registrar, you could just be the new registrar. You'll be talking to their customer service. They've got no knowledge of you.
Right.
They don't have any credentials to verify who you are. Whereas if you're dealing with the registrar, your original registrar, they can validate who you are, and you can validate that it's genuine, and also that it's not just forgetting to renew the name situation.
Right.
Because that's most commonly when I hear that, another registrar or another person's got my name, most common it's because they've failed to renew the name. And realistically, there's not much you can do at that point, other than rely on the goodwill of the new owner. And sometimes the new owner might go, oh, yeah, okay, you can have it back. But if they choose not to, there's not much you can do.
Right. And will my current registrar, like if I have a domain name registered at Melbourne IT, do you have records of all the transactions that happen on my domain name, so you can see that I registered on this date, I've renewed it a certain number of times, I signed in on this date, I requested an EPP code, and then transferred it out?
Yes. In fact, all registrars need to keep records. I think it's for about 7 years. So, part of our registrar accreditation is accurate record keeping, and we do have those records.
Great. So the first thing that someone should do if they notice their domain name is stolen, whether it actually is stolen or it's just not resolving to the location that they think, is to contact their support, contact the support group at their current registrar?
Yes.
Okay. All right. I think there's a lot of great information here, Bruce, that definitely clarifies the situation. Final question for you. Let's say that I have a domain portfolio for my business. It's 100 different domain names, some of which are high value, either because it's attached to my business or maybe just investment for domain names. Let's say that I've done all the things that you suggested. I've I've got a secure password. I've got two-factor authentication on my email. I have really secure passwords on the registrar. Maybe I'm using privacy on the registrar so you can't even see that I own it. If I pass away and I tell my wife that I've got this portfolio, how does she get access to, the list of domain names? And, let's assume that I'm a good husband. I'm not hiding anything. I want her to have the portfolio. What's the process that she would go through if I'm doing all the right security precautions that she can get access to the account?
Yeah, it's actually a very good question, because the other problem that mistake, and it happens at a couple of levels, we often actually get caught up in disputes. It could be divorce. It could be a business relationship between two people, and one person says, you're working together and you're getting along great, and one person says, I'll just register the domain name. We go, fine, but they register it in their own personal name.
Right.
And
great
then
point.
the business relationship fails, or the marriage fails, or whatever. And then you go, I'd like to access that name. It's like, well, you can't, because it's not in your name. I think it's really not much different to how you would treat a house or a bank account, in that certainly it's important to actually make sure that if it's a company, that you actually register it in the name of the company, not the employee, because that's a common mistake. Because if there's a dispute at some point, all we have is the name of the person that registered the name. So you want to make sure you use the proper company name. And then the other scenario is, obviously if you're registering it for personal reasons, and it's a family situation, you'd want to make sure that's properly documented. And I guess your scenario of a death in the family, that is treated like any other asset. So in your will, you would say, my wife or whatever should have access to this asset, and this is the details behind that asset. As long as you've got documentation, then you can take that to the registrar and say, look, here's my husband, was John Smith, and he's now died. Here's his death certificate. Here's the legal papers that now mean I'm now the rightful owner of the name. And then the registrar would just transfer the ownership of that name to the relevant partner.
Okay, and they would, my wife in this case would just go to the support group, or open a support ticket, or call the support line to initiate this?
Yeah, usually what happens in these I don't know exactly how all registrars operate, but certainly Melbourne IT has a sort of a general customer service area, but we also have a more of a complaints area that's managed by sort of paralegals, who in turn report to lawyers. So typically any dispute of that nature would go essentially through to our legal team. And I know GoDaddy and other big registrars do the same, and they will just look for appropriate documentation.
Excellent. And so great advice for a business partnership. If two principals have split up, if one of them has the domain names in his or her name, that could be problematic. Put it in the company name so that it's treated as an asset, just like all the other assets of the company.
Absolutely. Yes.
Great idea. All right. If you have additional questions, please post them in the comments below, and we'll ask Bruce to come back and answer as many of them as he can. Dr. Bruce Tonkin, Chief Technology Officer at Melbourne IT, thanks for coming on the Domain Sherpa Show, sharing your knowledge of security, and thanks for being a Domain Sherpa.
Thank you.
Thank you all for watching. We'll see you next time.